Just want to see how it looks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right, we're going to get started in a couple minutes. I'll be right back. All right, peace and blessings. Let me know if you can hear me. Thumbs up. All right, perfect. I want to thank you all for just being here in the space today with me. This is the first of many virtual book clubs to come. They might be virtual, they might be in person, but I just want to thank y'all for rocking with me. And thanks for, supporting the cause. This book is very important to me because the book details, it chronicles my Pan-Africanism. It chronicles my rising consciousness as an African person in North America and one who identifies with other Africans across the diaspora. So, whether you have the book or not, tonight's presentation is what I consider very easy to follow. We take excerpts from the book, but we also discuss themes that resonate with that. So, we're just going to go right into it. It's pretty straightforward. Once again, for those who don't know me, my name is Sam P.K. Collins. I'm a native Washingtonian of Liberian descent, and I am the author of Babylon Be Still, How a Journalist Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. So like I said, this presentation delves into that, and we're definitely going to explore a couple of themes. So about Babylon Be Still, you got two pictures of me right here. This is me in 2012. I was in grad school at the George Washington University. I had the fresh shape up, a little thicker. I was eating pork, beef. I had a different livity, so to speak. This was at the time when I was in grad school. I was studying journalism in undergrad, but then I went to grad school for public policy. And initially the goal was to learn about policy and how it affected Black people and use that information to make my journalism better. And during 2012, from 2011 to 2013, I was in internships and pursuing different opportunities with the mindset that I would go into these opportunities and talk about Black people and put Black people on Front Street for the major corporations, being NBC, whoever wanted to hire me that was so-called mainstream. And, I don't know if you can tell between that picture and the most recent picture of me holding the book, but in 2012, for reasons, I was in a depression, just considering the fact that I was at a crossroads. I wanted to pursue a certain route, but the forces that be within the journalism industry just would not allow me to be who it was that I wanted to be. So I was in a depression. I was trying to figure out who I was. I wanted to go a certain route, but that route in the box that I was not able to flourish. So Babylon Be Still speaks on that, not in an autobiographical format, but more so in memoirs where I'm reflecting on different issues around that time while also talking about my metamorphosis. So as you go through the book, you see a progression in my mind state and in the way that I adopt Pan-African nationalism, not just Pan-Africanism, but Pan-African nationalism. That nationalism is a very important word when we're talking about nation building and we're talking about building institutions that will strengthen our people at here and abroad, and especially on the African continent. It's all about getting on one accord. And this mindset started throughout the years, but it really manifested as I went against the grain and attempted to be more of a Pan-African, or at the very least attempted to speak about the ills that Black people were experiencing. So the book goes into several parts, and I actually have my copy back here. Let me get to it. If I could find it, give me a second. So here's my copy. It's kind of beat up. It's been through the ringer, but it has several parts. And what I like about the makeup of the book is that the print is pretty big. It's a lot of space, a lot of white space in particular. Margins is good for annotation, and it's a good read for people who may struggle to read a lot or who may not like reading at all. I found that a lot of the scholarly texts oftentimes are big with a lot of pages and the print is very small. I went about printing this in a different direction, just making the print a little bigger, double space and space around the margins so that you can annotate and take notes and reflect. Part one of the book is called Laying It Out Plain and Simple. And it's the first of It's the first of 6 or 7 parts in the book. So the book has 6 parts, in addition to an introduction and a closing chapter. So let's say about 8 parts, but 6 main parts. And this is the first of the 6 main parts, laying it out plain and simple. And within that part, you have 2 chapters, one of which is called Grassroots Journalism, A Trip in the Trenches, and the Manifesto of Pan-African Self-Determination. So during tonight's presentation, I'm going to read portions of those chapters, and I'm going to delve into the themes of those chapters, as well as attempt to answer questions. And for those of y'all who are in the Zoom, when it's time, I would like to get your feedback if you have any questions or if you have anything to add on the matter. So the 2 questions at hand tonight are: 1, how can journalists best represent and provide a diasporic education to the unheard masses of African people? Number 2, what does the author's Liberian background highlight about Liberia's potential to facilitate a modern day Pan-African Renaissance? 2 very important questions that are relevant to global events, but most importantly, this book. Grassroots Journalism, A Trip in the Trenches. We're about to jump right into an excerpt, and I'm going to read. One doesn't necessarily have to know much about Pan-African history or global politics to understand the importance of having his or her story told correctly. However, the degree of accuracy and empathy with which the African story gets told depends on the writer's Pan-African consciousness or lack thereof. In several cases, when non-Black reporters and Black reporters lacking race consciousness assess conditions in the Black community, they focus on the individual actions of the people living in those communities rather than the societal forces that created their environment. They often fall back on the notion that these men and women are in the situations they're in because of individual choices without looking at the situation with a wider societal lens. They also look at African people in the United States as a national minority rather than part of a global indigenous majority. Furthermore, reporters lacking an African consciousness will never produce news content in solidarity with oppressed Black people in their city and around the world. Just as the American media serves as the quote unquote 4th branch of government, a strong, independent Pan-African media conglomerate must represent the interests of Africans working to build a nation of their own. In order to unify around issues that affect their livelihood, African people must have some in-depth knowledge about the sources of their collective dysfunction. In addition, they must be exposed to credible voices on the front lines of global African nationhood. So-called mainstream newspapers, because of their assumption that the United States government is broken and not running just as the founding fathers intended, cannot fulfill those needs. Newspaper articles and opinion pieces often give credence to the Democratic and Republican parties, derivatives of the forces that subjugated African people since before the founding of the American Empire. Furthermore, these publications don't center the voices of self-determined African people or take into account the cultural foundation and sensitivity needed to accurately depict and analyze the status quo. Pages 13 to 15 of Babylon Be Still, How a Journalist Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. Very important text right here, and this speaks to the ethos of how I operate as a journalist in Banneker City, AKA Washington, DC, AKA the epicenter of the Babylon system. One very important aspect of this chapter is the term grassroots journalism. I coined this term grassroots journalism during my time at the Washington Informer newspaper, with whom I'm still writing to this day. But most importantly, I coined this term when I founded All Eyes on DC, what I called a grassroots news organization that operated out of Sankofa Video Books and Cafe between 2015 and 2020. And before All Eyes on DC went to Sankofa, it was at WEAC Radio in Southeast DC. Grassroots journalism, as it says here, is an effort to center and mobilize the masses of African people through the contextualization of our unique individual experiences. So like I said before in the text, the news, the mainstream news, as they call it, the news that was created out of the Eurocentric American paradigm, for one, prioritizes journalists who have mastered the Midwestern accent. The Midwestern accent meaning an accent in which you can't really tell where the person is from, an accent that lacks any kind of ethnic, that lacks any ethnicity. Point blank period, they don't want people on the news who sound like their region or where they come from. And the theory of relativity, I apply it to my life because even though I was able to go to a PWI, it was at a PWI where I became more aware of how African or how Black or how ethnic I was. Seeing as though in Chocolate City, Washington, DC, we're one out of many, but at a PWI, and more significantly, at a news station, you become aware of who you are and who you're not. So when I'm practicing at NBC Universal, you know, in front of the camera and talking, you have people, not white people, but Black people who have made it through the ranks, advising me, admonishing me for talking the way that I talk, for saying my T's a certain way, for saying my R's a certain way, for having what I discovered was a Southern drawl, because I didn't know I had that living in DC. It wasn't until, once again, I went to GW and I went to these internships that I realized the quote unquote accent that I had. So that's the very first thing, working in the mainstream media. They want you to identify with a Eurocentric paradigm in which you hide your ethnicity and that which makes you you. The second thing is that they give you this veil of objectivity where in reporting about the issues and about people, you only focus on the people themselves. You don't focus on who they are, where they come from, the circumstances in their lives. You don't focus on the totality of who they are and what made them who they are and where they came from. You only focus on them in that experience and in the instance in which you're reporting. If you do that though, that makes that person who you're covering less than a human being. But in a Eurocentric Urugu paradigm that is the news, and mind you, Eurocentric news, right? By the end of the day, Eurocentric news is an extension of a world that was created to be against us. In this paradigm, we are seen as less than human and not human. So if the newscaster, who is a Eurocentrically minded newscaster, interviews you and talks about you, they are not going to contextualize your experience. Contextualizing meaning providing an accurate African-centered background about your experience, which is why grassroots journalism is very necessary in contextualizing and providing information about people, where they come from, and the systems that are in place to subjugate them, in addition to the systems that are in place to free them of the mental and economic bondage and whichever other bondage that they have. Because it's very important that as African people, we take in images and information that reflects who we are. And if the information that we're receiving does not reflect our worldview, then we are at a disadvantage in this rat race. Because the news is only going to reaffirm what the Babylon system wants you to know, so that it can limit your imagination and it can limit your capacity to fight against it and defend yourself. Like I said before in the text, the media is the quote unquote fourth branch of the government. The media protects the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So when Donald Trump was allowed to take $1 billion in advertising revenue by being on the news in 2016, that was the fourth branch of government working that allowed him to seep into the imaginations of the quiet but loud Eurocentric masses throughout the United States. When the Bush administration had the major newspapers on the phone lines and fed them lines about weapons of mass destruction back in the early 2000s, that was the fourth branch of government working to legitimize the campaign in Iraq and in Afghanistan, right? When the fourth branch of government talks about what's happening on the African continent from the perspective of the dominating powers that are the EU and NATO, that is the fourth branch of government, not only working in concert with the American government, but with other governments that are working with the United States. We're talking about the European Union. We're talking about NATO. And this speaks to pretty much the fact that we as African people, we have to internationalize our perspective, because they're going to box us in as African people living in the United States. But that's something for us to speak on later. And before I move on, I want to acknowledge Denise W. Barnes. Denise W. Barnes, she did not coin the term grassroots journalism, but she was a woman, an ancestor now, who encouraged me, who taught me the game of journalism, right? She was the one who gave me the hands-on experience, who went through my stories and asked me questions about, did I take care of these people here? Did I accurately depict what was going on? She encouraged me to dot my I's and cross my T's, but most importantly, she told me never or to seldom feature talking heads being politicians and government officials who are most likely to lie, who are likely to tell a story that benefits them and their political future. In order to get real grassroots, you got to get to the people in the trenches, the moms, the pops, the grandmas, the mamas, the babas, the children, the people who are directly affected by the policies that the Babylon system wields out every single day. That is true grassroots journalism. And that grassroots journalism extended to what I call the All Eyes on DC model. Now, when I formed All Eyes on DC, I did so in 2011 after once again graduating from GW with my bachelor's degree in journalism. I did it initially as an attempt to bridge the gap between DC, what was known as Chocolate City, and Washington. The Washington that people only know as the State Department, the White House, the Washington Monument, because let's not get it twisted. People who visit Washington, DC, unless they are acculturated to the real culture, they don't know the real DC. So initially, before I adopted my Pan-African consciousness, All Eyes on DC was an attempt to bridge that gap. But as I got more and more in the news industry and I saw things that disgusted me, I knew that I needed to expand my consciousness and I needed to use journalism as a tool in expanding the consciousness of African people and putting our business on Front Street as a means of mobilizing and organizing people. And I did that while reading the readings of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and taking into consideration what I also learned about Malcolm X during my sophomore year at GW. As far as the All Eyes on DC model is concerned, we got 4 things here to look at, okay? So first of all, what you'll see here is that this was a music panel discussion that we had. You got Brother KO here, Baba KO. He's a saxophonist, very prominent go-go saxophonist, been in a lot of bands. We got Matt Swamp Guinea, you know, go-go legend himself. He has a particular subgenre of go-go, you know, one that connects us to the diaspora. He's an ambassador for that genre in the diaspora. And we got Afi Soul. Afi Soul, another great artist, one who has a strong foothold in the DC community. These were panelists who spoke about their music on the All Eyes on DC show at Sankofa. And as you can see here, this was an open show. People, whether they were there for the show or not, they had a chance to sit down and listen. And this is what I call grassroots journalism, because it took place in the community and it featured community figures who more than likely you would not see on NBC or CNN, because news, right, has to be done in the griot style where we are holding each other up and where we are pretty much doing what it is that we have to do to tell our own story, to propagandize the aspects of our culture and to document what is happening with us in real time. So you have to include the audience in your story. You just can't talk at them, first of all. Second of all, like I said, you got to set community figures. Third of all, you got to create a griot-like space. So we called on the ancestors in this space, right? We did call and response. I go, I may, okay? I gave respect to the elders in the space. I allowed audience members to jump in and to talk, right? At times, unlike in the news studio, people would jump out and make comments, and we would change the direction of the show based on how the spirit moved us, because it was grassroots journalism. This was news as it was mandated by the ancestors. Last and foremost, we had to center Mama Africa in the discussion, because by the end of the day, we are Africans. That's it, and that's all. We took grassroots journalism to another level in the newspaper. All thanks and praises to the Washington Informer, because they've allowed me to be a grassroots journalist, and they actually take pride in us being grassroots journalists. Black media, okay, Black media, despite criticisms, for those of us on the margins about Black media being, a tool of the Democratic Party or being too lenient on the Democratic Party, Black media has always been a pathway for people to go on and do other things in the news industry. It has also been a vehicle in majority Black communities to tell the news about what's going on. And it's also been an organizing tool. So that's what we used it as when Karan Hilton Brown was killed in a police chase along Kennedy Street in 2020. While other newspapers and outlets might have focused on the protest and what took place at 4th District, me, myself, I had a chance to speak with family members, people who knew him, and we had a chance to contextualize, once again, contextualize, right? Contextualize, add background and additional information to paint a different picture about what was taking place, okay? About what happened and how it led to the deadly car chase that put him in a coma and initially brought his life to an end. Because long before Karan Hilton Brown was taken out by the Metropolitan Police Department, people in his neighborhood had a contentious relationship with the police department. Nothing unlike what happens in Baltimore, in Mississippi, South Carolina, New York, parts of Africa, parts of Europe, wherever we are in the world, there's a power dynamic between the police and between the people who live in communities, whether they are Black, brown, white, whatever is the case, because by the end of the day, it is a power struggle. And what we do here is a fight for equity, a fight to be more communal. So in executing the tools of grassroots journalism, we are being more communal, and we are being a vehicle through which people can trust us. And speaking of trust, keep in mind that the people who I spoke with would not speak with the Washington Post, because the Washington Post, by virtue of being a mainstream publication, has a reputation for doing Black people dirty. That is the #1 rule in grassroots journalism. You have to gain the trust of the people and go to places where others can't go. And that means having the confidence of the Most High, that the Most High and the noble ancestors got your back because you're doing good. So I was able to go to the courtrooms where the protesters were being seen by the judge. I got a chance to go into the neighborhoods, the communities where the brother lived, and where other brothers and sisters live who have been killed by police or during police encounters. This is what being a grassroots journalist is about: gaining the trust of the people, telling their story, humanizing them, and doing what you can to make ties to Mama Africa. So the question once again is, right, how can journalists better represent and provide a diasporic education to the unheard masses of African people? First, as a journalist, you have to adopt an African-centered worldview, okay? That means identifying with the global African diaspora, okay? And that means viewing history, culture, and politics beyond the American paradigm. As you will read in this book, I am not a Democrat, nor am I a Republican. I am a nationalist. I'm a Pan-African nationalist. I'm a fundamentalist. Because fundamentally, we have to center Africa in everything that we do. We have to center the African nation, which starts at the African family and African institutions in everything that we do. Until you have an African-centered worldview, nothing that you do will be in the interest of African people. Point blank, period. After you adopt an African-centered worldview, you create stories highlighting the African connection. So anywhere you can, once you have that worldview, you put on your glasses. As a journalist, you go out into the world and you make any and every attempt to make a connection to Africa, to connect people to Africa in your stories. And it doesn't have to be overtly Africa, because as the rest of the presentation will show, everything about us is African. From the way that we move, the way that we talk, the music that we produce, the foods that we cook. They are part of the African diasporic culture, and they are remnants of what was lost in the Ma'afa, also known as the African Holocaust. So you are African, but you have to tap into your Afrocentricity before you can be a journalist or any other profession. Once you create stories highlighting the African connection, you must prioritize the voices of common everyday people over that of politicians, government officials, and other talking heads. Talking heads, you do not want to mess with them. You only mess with them for commentary and for context, because they have information, but the question is what they're telling you beneficial to them? And to what degree is it? So you have to maintain a skepticism when dealing with talking heads. That's not to say that regular everyday people aren't untrustworthy, because believe me, I've been in situations where regular everyday people have lied to me and I had to look behind that. But as a journalist, overall, no matter who you talk to, you got to maintain a certain level of skepticism, especially when it comes to government officials. Because in the Babylon system, once again, you are an African in a world that is anti-African, and you have to adopt that African-centered worldview and deal with government officials with a skeptical eye. Last but not least, you got to include cultural, historical, and political context in stories that humanize Black people. So in order to humanize Black people, you got to look at what they do in a historical, cultural, and political context. So once again, going back to the story of Karan Hilton Brown, you got to look at the history of the interactions between young people and police officers along that strip on Kennedy Street. You got to look at the politics in a racially changing city where there are schisms between the old and the new, where white upper middle class newcomers are changing their neighborhoods and are bringing forth ordinances and are pressuring police officers to clean up the so-called dirty work, right? And when you talk about the cultural aspect, when you're talking about African people being able to do them and post up and commune, certain things get lost in the sauce when the Yoruba come in the neighborhoods and make changes. And then they have the newspapers behind them legitimizing their every move, which is why, once again, a Pan-African media conglomerate must be on the front lines of dispelling any notions that Black people, that African people are less than. We have to propagandize, and propagandize again. And before I move on, I want to bring your attention to the inverted pyramid. The inverted pyramid is a tool that journalists use in the game. This pretty much tells you, right? So back in the day, before computers were a thing, whenever you typed a story, they would bring the most important information at the very top and the least important information at the bottom. In the event that you had to shorten the story, you would just cut from the bottom because that stuff didn't really matter. It was the least important. The idea was that you kept the most important stuff, the lead, at the very top. After the lead, you had the nut graph. The nut graph tells us why should the reader care about the story. So if I'm a journalist and I'm talking about my African people, I'm going to include their voices at the very top, okay? And then I'm going to tell you why you should care about them right here in the nut graph with the historical, political, and cultural context that is African-centered. And that right there is how to be a journalist. The nut graph and the inverted pyramid in general, I learned in the PWI, but the cultural aspects of the craft I learned while on the job in the grassroots. At this time, I'm taking any questions or thoughts. If there are none, we'll keep it moving. But if there are, the floor is open.
Okay, so who would you say kind of, you mentioned Garvey, but are there any others other than the one ancestor that you mentioned in like the DC area that kind of like help you propel yourself into this kind of grassroots journalist paradigm?
He's not an ancestor, but Barrington Salmon, he's a top-notch journalist. You need to look him up. Very top-notch journalist. I worked with him at the Informer, okay. And he helped me at times. I oftentimes assisted him by collecting quotes and going out into the streets, talking to different people. I did that during Obama's second inauguration. I went out downtown, talked to different people, collected quotes, and I also helped out with different stories. He was my Jegna, my mentor, somebody who I looked to for advice, somebody who encouraged me to keep going. So I definitely looked to him. As far as ancestors, you got Walter Rodney, you got Gil Noble, Tell It Like It Is. You got Martin Delany, because he was a Black nationalist in the 19th century. He talked about, us in the United States being a nation within a nation. You can't deny that. Ida B. Wells, man, like without a doubt. She told us that a Black person must keep a Winchester on them at all times. And she knew, because when she wrote about the propaganda that the Yurugu were talking about with the lynching and how they used anti-Black male propaganda to legitimize the lynching of Black men, she got ran out of Memphis. They burned down her newspaper, but she continued to organize from Chicago. She even worked with Garvey, So you talk about Garvey, talk about Malcolm X, you know what I'm saying? Whole lot of people, especially Malcolm X, man. Like when I learned about Malcolm X and his Pan-Africanness, toward the end of his life, like that in itself was very inspiring. But I can definitely talk about that, later on in the presentation, If there are no more questions or thoughts, we can definitely move on. But that was a very good question. I could talk at length about that for days. I ain't gonna lie to you. Give me 1 second. I got to turn off the stove real quick, or the oven, rather. All right, let's get back to it. All right, so we're going to go on the second chapter in the book, or the second main chapter. This is the second part of the second chapter in the first part, right? And this is the manifesto, a manifesto of Pan-African self-determination. This portion reads, as a teenager who toed the line between the classroom and the streets, my distinctive African features and hybrid Liberian DC accent made me a prime target of foes eager to score points off of a young man who didn't completely understand the gravity of the disdain some African Americans had toward Black immigrants, particularly continental Africans. In college, during a period when gentrification really took off in the district, I developed a class consciousness in the midst of diplomatic rebuttals against my boarding school educated peers' tone-deaf comments about DC's unique culture and the working class Black Washingtonians, who they derogatorily called locals. I also suffered slightly from the slick comments of continental Africans of various nationalities who didn't respect Liberia as Africa's first republic founded by freed Black women and men in the United States. All of this happened before I fully and unabashedly embraced the Pan-African ideology and gained true knowledge of self. My undergraduate experience and graduate studies immediately following proved the most stressful in my adult adolescence. It was a period of growth and inner conflict about Black identity as I navigated in and around the professional realm. Because I didn't understand my value as a Black man and Babylon's abhorrence for raw African energy, I adopted a mindset and habits that made me no different than the elements of the hood I tried to escape. Looking back, I learned that no matter where we stand on the socio-economic ladder, Black people have little autonomy and means of self-determination in a white-centered system. Pages 25 to 28, Babylon Be Still, How a Journalist Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. Powerful, very powerful, you know, so this part of the presentation is going to touch on quite a lot. You know, by virtue of being from DC and of being of Liberian descent, I would like to argue that I was destined to take on this paradigm and this Pan-African liberty, because DC is so diverse when it comes to Black people and people of African descent. And Liberia has a very interesting history as it relates to the diaspora and as it relates to repatriation and our aspirations as repatriates. So long before I was born and brought into the Babylon system in my physical form, everything was laid out for me to pursue this path, which is what I want to delve into during this part of the presentation. Pan-African nationalism. And keep in mind that these are portions from my next book that'll come out sometime in the near future. But the next book that I have touches on Pan-African nationalism. And it touches on it because, you know, a criticism or feedback that I got about Babylon Be Still was that I did not define Pan-Africanism in depth. And I take that, you know, I wrote this with the understanding that people might have known what it was, or I thought that I articulated it enough, but apparently I wasn't too direct in what it was. So the next book that's coming out, a portion of which you can read right here, will delve into Pan-African nationalism, but it will also delve into my spiritual ascension, right? Because we as Africans, right, our paradigm is not only political and cultural, it is spiritual. It is all that mixed in one. The Babylon system and the Yurugu who run it, they have compartmentalized different parts of our existence. So they've separated everything. And they tell us, right, they tell us legally that church is separate from state, but we know that not to be the case. So even as they compartmentalize different aspects of our experience, they still created a society that holds strong to their truth that you can't separate culture, spirituality, and government. Because in the African society, there's a theocracy, there's a chiefdom, there's a chieftaincy, there are families, okay? All of that is intact when we talk about Pan-African nationalism, and all of that is what I kept into consideration over the years in which I developed incrementally a Pan-African consciousness. So we're talking about Pan-African nationalism, and when we talk about it, we see that it demands that we not only act as Africans, but we revere African figures, history, and culture while building community institutions of benefit to African people. Okay, so this is what Marcus Messiah Garvey called African fundamentalism. You have to uphold your ancestors. You have to uphold your institutions. You have to think black, be black, act African in every way possible. And it goes beyond just talking in YouTube, and you got to build institutions. So if you're not going to build a news industry institution, you can go into the trades. You can go into education. I'm a very proud Mwalimu, a very proud teacher in the African-centered community. That is something that I hold near and dear to my heart, because I work with institutions. Not only do we talk about it, we live it, because we got to create a paradigm for our young people, something that they can be inculcated in, something in which they can live and be who they truly are, where they can be authentic. And with that being said, I got to take it to the next point. African people in the United States, okay, they must now and forever see themselves as a nation separate from the American empire. And in doing so, they must connect with other African people on the African continent and around the world. Okay, we are part of a global majority. That is exactly what this flag represents, because it is Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. And I added this slide here because, like I told y'all, right, I adopted my Pan-African paradigm and my worldview in increments. In 2013, I had a chance to watch a film called Straight Up Go-Go. Now, mind you, go-go is an indigenous art form in DC that's gained popularity or national and international prominence over the last 3 years or so with Don't Mute DC. It's been around much longer than that, okay? And what I came to find out in 2013 upon watching this film, which I actually watched around my birthday in 2013 or 2013, exactly. Wow, yeah, nearly 10 years ago, okay? So I watched this film, and mind you, once again, being of Liberian descent, living in a city where there are often ethnic schisms between African Americans and continental Africans, I got to see that the art form that I loved so much, go-go, had African roots. And never did it click to me that the same way that they beat the congas and the go-go's is the same way that our ancestors and our counterparts on the continent beat the drums in the same way. So over time, as I grew deeper in my development, I found a common thread between Liberian Pentecostal music, go-go, and Nyabingi drumming that the Rastafari do, okay? You see a common thread because, once again, spirituality. Even with the Christianization of African people, we did not take on Christianity like the Yoruba did, right? Mind you, when you go to your Yoruba church, what happens? It's very quiet, it's very, very mundane, not a lot of spirit, so to speak. It's very cold. But you go to an African church, regardless of the denomination, everybody's upbeat. People are catching the Holy Ghost. There's a lot of that energy that has kept true and to which we have stayed true throughout the Ma'afa. So on this side of the world, in Liberian churches, Pentecostal churches to be exact, you're going to see the drums. You're going to see different instruments, a lot of livelihood, okay? A lot of lively music. Same thing in the go-go, call and response. Same thing with Nyabingi drumming, call and response, calling in the spirits. Aliyah, Selassie, Jah, Rastafari, right? This is very, very important to understand. And it is, and music is is an aspect of the African experience that shows that we are not separate. You cannot separate African people when our music has so many commonalities, and that commonality being the African continent. Now we're going to get into Liberia and Garveyism. Very, very important. Very important. Now, just a little bit about Liberia. Of course, Liberia, it was founded as a colony in 1822. They gained their independence in 1847. In 1822, the American Colonization Society, also known as ACS, they facilitated, right, the repatriation of freed Black Americans to Africa to found their own colony. Okay, so a little bit of context behind that. In 1801, 1802 or so, the Haitian people, they fought for their independence against the French. And just to show how connected we are as a diaspora, there were people in the American government, Thomas Jefferson, for instance, who were watching the events in Haiti very closely. Because keep in mind, when the French lost to Haiti, right, they could no longer hold on to what they had in North America, which led to the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so everything in history is connected. When Napoleon and his people in France could no longer hold on to Haiti, right, they had to let go of what the U.S. eventually bought in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, and this was in 1802. At the very same time, Thomas Jefferson saw what was happening, right, in Haiti and in other parts of the world, the Western world, in terms of slave revolts, that he got very scared about what could happen in the United States. And don't get it twisted. Since the mid-16th century, African people have been fighting back in the United States and in North America at large. It wasn't just Nat Turner. And that is what scared Thomas Jefferson. It scared him to the point where he and James Monroe, for who the capital city of Liberia is named Monrovia, they conceptualized this idea of the repatriation of freed Blacks. They did not want the freed men and women in the United States to so-called infect the minds of the enslaved Africans. They did not want them here to inspire enslaved Africans to break the bondage of slavery, to break their chains. So they were expelled and sent to Liberia to form their own colony called Liberia, okay? And what I'm about to talk about in this second point is very important for y'all to understand, because this speaks to class and ethnic schisms that have retarded or held back the progression of Liberian society. In Liberia, as my man Putu, brother Putu would always say, is very, very important, right? When we're talking about Pan-Africanism and we're talking about liberating the continent, Liberia is very important. And the United States knew that, which is why they held Liberia down as a so-called ally. So we have a lot of us who like to talk about Liberia being, you know, we often herald Liberia and Ethiopia as being the two uncolonized nations on the African continent. And that's a good title and all, but I often rebut that by saying that Liberia was and continues to be colonized by the United States. If you as a nation in this world celebrate your Independence Day annually, by virtue of you celebrating your Independence Day, that means that you were colonized. Liberians do not want to hear this, but in order for us to heal and break the bondage of slavery, we have to hear this. Once again, if you celebrate your independence annually, then you, my friend, my brother, my sister, were colonized. Liberia was and continues to be colonized by the United States of America. And you see that in the way that the flag looks. You see that in the way that the minority that was the Black repatriates, the way that they subjugated the indigenous majority. They colonized them. That's why it was called the American Colonization Society. This was an example in which the United States facilitated the situation by which it got its own colony on the continent, and it got a tool from which they can take resources and actualize their geopolitical aspirations on the continent. And they did that through the help of a minority group that they called Americo-Liberians. And this is very important when talking about Garvey's program in the UNIA. when in the early 20th century, Marcus Messiah Garvey looked at Cape Palmas, from which my father's people came from, okay? He looked at that as the site for the Back to Africa program. That was going to be the site where Africans repatriating through the UNIA would go to set up their place, to return to their homeland. But that never materialized for a bevy of reasons that I will get to in just a second. And before I do so, I want to point your attention to this flyer here. So in the early 20th century, the 1920s to be exact, they were talking about repatriating. And then you also got Firestone here, rubber plantations. Liberia is known for rubber. You tap the rubber tree, you take the rubber out, you can make a lot of tires. I'll leave it at that. Before we even get into this, I want to make a very important point, a point that cannot go unaddressed. And this goes to what I said earlier about your Independence Day. And this is a message, not a message, but just a point that I want to make. Because oftentimes, right? Oftentimes, once again, and I've encountered this as a Liberian or an African of Liberian nationality, or parents of Liberian nationality. I've encountered Africans from Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Kenya, whoever, wherever. Whenever I say Liberia, they would often tell me, oh, you guys aren't real Africans. You guys are Americans. You guys are not real Africans, right? And, you know, that used to piss me off. I'm going to be honest. But the fact is that the whole continent was colonized. There is no way that you as an African can deny that colonization has taken effect and to a degree still affects us as Africans. If your curriculum is still in a Eurocentric language, you've been colonized. If your parliament or your judicial system has judges wearing blonde wigs, like they did in the American and British system, you have been colonized. If children are wearing school uniforms, Eurocentric school uniforms, and are learning from a Eurocentric paradigm, you have been colonized. If the people in your cities and your towns are losing their indigenous languages, you have been colonized. So whether it's Liberia, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, wherever, we have been colonized. And it goes back to what I said about your Independence Day. If you celebrate an Independence Day every year, then you, my friend, at one point have been colonized. And we cannot deny that. And we cannot attempt to get brownie points off of one another and let, you know, things like who founded us or whatever get in the way of our unity. Because the Europeans in the 1800s, they hosted the Berlin Conference. They created these borders that separate us. So you're talking about countries that are figments of the European imagination. These are borders that did not exist. You have tribes or nations, African nations, the Bassa people, the Kru people, for example, the Gribbo people that are scattered all across European borders. So the borders that were set up, once again, were of the European imagination, and we have to understand that so that we don't get caught up in national identity. Me, myself, I don't even say I'm Liberian. I identify myself according to the nation that was around before Liberia was formed. I'm a Gribbo man and a Bassa man. The Bassa, they traveled from Sudan, and the Gribbo were along the coastline of Liberia, next to the Ivory Coast. And before I move on, like we have right here, Liberia got its independence first. They don't put the US there because semantics, the US didn't colonize it necessarily, but the US did. Then you got South Africa. And even with South Africa, you had apartheid. Egypt colonized. Ethiopia wasn't colonized necessarily, but it did fall to Italy, during the Ethiopia-Italo, war. Libya, Sudan, Morocco, Tunisia, Ghana, right? After Ghana got its freedom or its independence, we saw Guinea come behind it, Cameroon, Senegal, Togo, Mali, Congo, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, so forth and so on. And even with that, still colonized to this day. Still colonized to this day because of the fact that we got neo-colonialism that's in effect. Neo-colonialism, a system through which, the European nations and other nations for that matter have control over the economic affairs of the African nations. So you have heads of state who are not beholden to their people. They're more so beholden to multinational corporations and European powers. They're giving natural resources to the Europeans and not to their own people. This is what we're dealing with. But going back to the 1920s, Garvey couldn't manifest his vision because, as is often the case, you have people of your skin tone working against you. For one, we had W.E.B. Du Bois and Liberian government officials. They foiled Garvey's plan. And this was before W.E.B. got a change of heart later on down the line and adopted what would ultimately be known as Pan-Africanism. But back then, Garvey called it fundamentalism, but now it's called Pan-Africanism. That's Henry Sylvester Williams and W.E.B. They coined that term, they popularized it. But Garvey and Martin Delany and others before them, they were the ones who formed that nucleus. And last but not least here, we're talking about class and ethnic schisms within Liberian society that created an anti-African atmosphere. Okay? Like I said before, the Americo-Liberian minority, they were the ruling class. They were the ones that imposed class rule. They were the ones, even though you had some Liberians of indigenous background, they entered government. They still done an intergovernment. And this was a situation that precipitated, the coup of 1980 that brought Samuel K. Doe to power. And this was the situation that pretty much led to the Civil War from the late 80s that took place all the way to 2003 or so. All because of ethnic squabbles that were fueled by the United States government. Look it up. It's them. They continue to divide and balkanize us, and we fall for it time and time again. And it's very easy because we are the majority. So as the majority, we oftentimes find more differences among ourselves than our similarities. And it makes it very easy because we are the majority. It's easy to pick us off one by one. But Pan-Africanism speaks to our common destiny as African people. And in adopting it, we have to understand that we got to get back to our customs and traditions that make us African people. And we also got to keep in mind that the Europeans, they may not like each other, but they know when to unite. So the question once again is, what does the author's Liberian background highlight about Liberia's potential to facilitate a modern day Pan-African Renaissance? And what I will say is that Liberia should have, and once, I don't want to sound competitive, I don't want to sound competitive, but Liberia should have been where Ghana is right now. Ghana has fashioned itself, during the whole 400-year anniversary. Ghana fashioned itself as a home for diasporic Africans. Diasporic Africans, they look to Ghana, they look to Kenya, Tanzania, for example, as places where they can go, right, to repatriate. Liberia could have been the same thing, but its institutionalization as a country was not natural. it was facilitated by a power, the United States, that had other things in mind for that nation. So as the slide here says, Liberians are aware of the ethnic schisms in their history, and they are skeptical about Pan-Africanism, as are other Africans of other nationalities. So in order to facilitate a renaissance, that's my dog, he's hungry, he smells the chicken I made for him, so you gotta forgive him. You gotta depend on the US less, right? And depending on the US less means bolstering self-determination. So creating independent institutions, preserving indigenous customs, right? We also need cross-continental collaboration, right? We need to create a system, a situation where we are able, as African people, able to take part in the Renaissance and in building up our continent, because our continent is as much ours as it is anybody else's. And we find that, you know, European people and other people are less afraid of Africa than we are, but that has to change sometime soon. And last but not least, I would say tell the story of Garvey and others who have attempted to forge connections. Because when we talk about Liberia and Sierra Leone, that part of the story often gets left out, which is why we have to tell it, and we got to create a holistic historical picture about what's really taking place. Any questions or thoughts while I let you guys ruminate on that? I'm going to feed this dog real quick. All right, I'm back. The dog's fed. Everybody's happy. Are there any questions or thoughts about, you know, what about what I said?
You go back to one of your previous slides about you referenced like a renaissance a couple of times, I think, throughout the presentation so far. If you had influence and power to kind of see that come into fruition, like what do you think is like the first like step one?
I think step one would be readopting our indigenous languages and launching a campaign to teach children the languages and make those languages the main languages of the nations. And I would also say adopting a constitution for United African States where, and this is what's called Pan-African federalism. You should look it up. I encourage you to. You know, it's a campaign where African nations fulfill the vision of Kwame Nkrumah, which was not to stop at the liberation of each African nation, but to form a federation of African nations so that we would be unified. And because unity is the strongest defense against colonization. And we were at a crossroads where it was either about being separate as African countries or forming a United States of Africa. Unfortunately, we went by the way of keeping separate, and that has prevented Africa from developing on its own. So to answer your question, I would go about, if I had power and influence, facilitating the political unification of the diaspora through a constitution that reinstates a mode of government that precedes European governments, right? In which we had chieftaincies, something that reflects who we are as African people, a government. I would have to do more research on that. That would take consultation with elders, people who are knowledgeable in that type of stuff. You know, I want to see a government that reflects who we are as African people. If it's not a Republican style of government, then what is it that African people had before colonization? We need that back. And we also need to learn our languages. Because English is a language of commerce, but when you're talking about tapping into your ancestry and learning customs and standards that we knew, we need to tap into our languages. That's very important. It's a very good question. Thank you, bro. What I will say before we wrap up, you know, is that this book is the beginning. You know, I would encourage, you know, those of y'all who are listening to, the book is a good read for all levels, you know, and I just can't reiterate enough. I'm not only a journalist, I'm an educator. I don't teach within the Babylon paradigm, even though at one time I did, but I don't anymore. You know, I teach youth in African-centered situations because it is important that we create institutions that help us preserve our culture. And even on the continent, they may not have those, you know, for whichever reason, but it goes to show that colonization is global and the powers that be have made it so. So in reading this book, I'm hoping that whoever reads it, that they take action in whichever way possible, and that they adopt a philosophy in which they are committed to preserving their families, their communities, African-centered institutions, and in which they are organizing for a new world, because we need it beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Bro, I gotta, oh, can I ask another question real quick?
Yeah, come on, by all means.
When you were talking about the issue with the brother on the moped, and you said that you were able to go into the neighborhood and talk to people who didn't trust the Washington Post, stuff like that. That was interesting because I often see people who look to CNN and these quote unquote mainstream like outlets as the source, and who would overlook the Washington Informer. So like, what do you see, like are there like class dynamics at play when you see certain people who subscribe to the Informer and don't watch CNN versus like our people who only watch CNN and like NBC or whatever, like whatever? Is it like, do you see that there are class issues that are like making that divide? Because I mean, I'm just interested. I'm just kind of interested in yeah, knowing how to bring more people into like a Washington Informer who only trust like a CNN, you know?
That's a good question because I think there's an overlap. I think that, you have people who trust both the Informer and CNN. You have people who may not trust neither. And you might have people who trust either or. The appeal of CNN is that it's on 24/7 and that that it's televised. Our people, I'm not going to generalize people, they have an affinity for television and for seeing things that are visual. When it comes to print, there's a little less of an affinity. And I think that the Washington Informer's golden ticket, so to speak, is that it has a connection to the community. So when we talk about grassroots journalism, for people to be able to see themselves, this is the saving grace of the newspaper. For people to be able to see themselves in the newspaper that's located in their community says a lot, because the Washington Informer is located on the south side, east of the river, Congress Heights, right? Not too far from South Capitol Street, right on MLK. And it's right there in the heart of the community. You can walk up to the newspaper any time of the day. The publisher, the reporters are very approachable people, right? So people, that's a good thing and a bad thing in the sense that because it's a neighborhood institution, people might take for granted what it is that it can do. But at the same time, they don't, because they're so close to the newspaper, they appreciate it even more, whereas they might see CNN as outside the bounds of what, they can get. And let's keep in mind that during Ferguson, what happened in Ferguson, we saw what happened when Don Lemon and other newscasters commented on what the protesters were doing down there, the smell of weed smoke and all. We saw, in real time what the mainstream media was capable of or not capable of. So I think during that time, media outlets like the Washington Informer became even more important and more loved. And I would also say that that definitely became the case during the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, people looked to the Informer for news, you know what I'm saying? Like for information. They wanted a Black-centered, voice. And I would say more of the other people more than our people, because everybody, they want to know what's happening with Black people. That we're the flavor of the day. I know why, but that's the reality though. I'm not sure if I answered your question,
Yeah, I get you answered it. I think you didn't, it sounds like you don't think that it's necessarily like class at play when people sway towards one end or the other. I think what I heard you saying is that the Informer in relation to this, like DC, is maybe partially because it's in the neighborhood and it's representative of the people in that neighborhood. So,
yeah.
And that, the article that I brought up, the story I brought up was, I'm assuming it happened also on that.
Well, it happened on the other side of town,
okay.
but it was similar to other situations because there was another police-involved shooting. There's a police-involved shooting that I wrote about that happened right around the corner from the Informer. Mm-hmm. And yeah, a lot has happened in those communities, Hold on one second. As far as the whole class thing, DC is a very interesting place in the sense that DC's got a class dynamic as well, because we're close to the DC, we're close to the federal government. You do have your not so well-to-do people, but you also got your folks who work in DC government and then the federal government, and then you got folks who are in close proximity to power. So it's like it's cool at times, but it could also be annoying because, you know, it's like everybody here is about who you know, how you know them, what connections you got, things like that. Everybody's an activist or a protester, you know, you get used to it, you know, and DC is a powerful city in that sense. But I think that the Informer, you know, because of that dynamic, because of the fact that everybody's involved in something in DC, that makes the Informer that much more important to people because people, they want to be featured in it. So you often, as a reporter, get a lot of emails and phone calls about, hey, I have this event down the street. Can you come to it? Hey, we're doing this campaign. Can you cover it? Hey, this just happened over here. Because everybody in DC, regardless of whether you want food stamps or you can buy the whole grocery store out of pocket, you're an activist. Even in Ward 8, as down and out as some of the people are in Ward 8 and in Ward 7, they are still making it work. And they are on the front lines, and they they will go to the Informer to make sure that their story gets covered. That's why I don't see class as a thing. I think I see the Informer, and especially in DC, being in the trenches as an example of what community looks like when people are doing things in the community and they see respected publications covering it, and they look to it as a tool in just like advancing their cause, you know.
All right, bet. Yeah, thank you.
Nah, you know, no doubt. So, you know, please visit Amazon.com and leave a review. You know, if you enjoyed the presentation. If you haven't purchased the book yet, you can visit Sankofa. I'm still working on getting the books in other places. We also got it in Georgia at the Tanger outlets at what's called Geechee outlets. Geechee Roots. Yes, shout out to them. Sold a couple copies down there, but you can get it online. You can also get it at Sankofa in DC and at Geechee Roots in Georgia. I'm Sam Collins, and you know, this was my presentation. Babylon be still, y'all. Peace and blessings.
Peace, bro.